He's been a visiting fellow with the Council for Foreign Relations in New York and currently directs the military history program at West Point, the United States Military Academy. His forthcoming book, Wrong Turn, America's Deadly Embrace of Counterinsurgency, gets published next month, and this is kind of a window into it here for Northern California. So upon retirement, Colonel Gentile will serve as a senior historian at the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C. So please join me in welcoming Colonel Gentile.
Thanks, Eaton, for that very warm introduction, and thanks to the Marine Memorial Association for bringing me out here. As you could gather from what Eaton had to say about me, I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Danville. My father, so coming back to San Francisco is really a treat for me because this was the place where I grew up as a kid. My father grew up in the Bronx, New York, and was in the Civilian Conservation Corps in the early 40s, and then the war started. He met my mother in Sacramento, then deployed, spent 2 years in India, then came back, and then went through the GI Bill, graduated from USF. And so as a kid, I grew up coming from Danville. I remember coming into the city at a Fisherman's Wharf and eating and everything else. So it's really a treat for me to be here, to be able to speak to the Marine Memorial Association, you folks, and in San Francisco. Let me start this way. How about this for an idea? Counterinsurgency is finished. It's over. It's done. Now, when I say counterinsurgency is finished, I'm not saying that the United States won't do counterinsurgency again somewhere in the future, although it's hard to imagine where we might try to do this again. But I'm not saying that counterinsurgency won't happen again for the United States military at some point in the future. When I say counterinsurgency is finished, here is what I mean. I'm saying that the idea that counterinsurgency has worked as an operational method employed by strategy to achieve policy aims at a reasonable cost in blood and treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan. The idea that counterinsurgency worked, that idea is what is finished and what is dead and what is over. Let me explain what I mean when I say counterinsurgency, because there's a lot of different ways to go about countering an insurgency. But for the next 20 or 30 minutes of my talk, when I use this term counterinsurgency, here's what I mean. It's a specific kind of way of countering an insurgency, and it's basically what has been codified in the American Army and Marine Corps' field manual for counterinsurgency, Field Manual 3-24, that was published in December of 2006. It's what the American Army and Marines have done in Afghanistan and Iraq for the last 10, 12 years. And it basically centers around a couple of ideas. And the idea is that a counterinsurgent force like the American Army and Marines can put itself down on the ground in a foreign land somewhere where an insurgency is occurring. Also probably in the middle of some kind of civil war. And this foreign occupying military force can put itself down, and it will do a number of things simultaneously, according to American counterinsurgency. It will provide security to the local population. It will build infrastructure like roads and bridges. It will improve the economy. It will establish and build local governance. It will help build the host nation's security forces. And the idea behind counterinsurgency is that if these things are done simultaneously in this place where an insurgency is occurring, then the population will be won over to the counterinsurgent side and the side of the government that it's supporting. The population will be separated from the insurgents, and then the insurgents can be easily tracked down and captured or killed. This is basically the idea, the method of American counterinsurgency, and it's again been codified in Field Manual 3-24. It's when you hear generals and Army and Marine officers speaking, they speak the language of American counterinsurgency, like protecting the population. So when I use the term counterinsurgency, that's what I am talking about. And if you haven't already figured out, American counterinsurgency is basically the same thing as armed nation building. I mean, if you think about it, if the idea is to build up local governance, build up infrastructure like roads, bridges, schools for girls, build up the economy, build up the security forces, we're talking about building the institutions of a modern state. So when I use the term American counterinsurgency, it's also synonymous with the term armed nation building. And it's this kind of counterinsurgency, when I say counterinsurgency is over, and the idea that counterinsurgency has worked in Iraq and Afghanistan to achieve policy aims at a reasonable cost in blood and treasure. That's what I'm saying is finished, and it's over. That idea that it has worked. And let's just go through some of the numbers with regard, and statistics with regard to Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's start with Iraq. Close to 250,000 Iraqis killed, close to 1 million Iraqis displaced from their original homes, very few of them having returned. 4,883 Americans killed, tens of thousands with life-changing wounds, close to, depending on the estimate, $3 trillion America has spent in Iraq. We've replaced one strong-armed dictator, Saddam Hussein, with another, Nouri al-Maliki. This one is closely aligned with our regional enemy or adversary in the Middle East, Iran. And civil war is still occurring in Iraq. Then think about it, and I've thought about this before. If the United States had gone into Iraq, once the policy decision was made to remove the regime, whether or not that was the right policy decision to make is another issue. But once the policy decision was made to go in and remove the regime, and if the United States, in this hypothetical, would have left, would the amount of death and destruction have been any worse than the actual 8.8 years of American occupation? Then let's talk about Afghanistan. Right now, probably close to 2,200 Americans killed, thousands of Afghans killed, close to $1 trillion spent in Afghanistan, and with the idea that America's core political objective in Afghanistan was largely met by early 2002. So with all these numbers, right, the idea that counterinsurgency worked, when you juxtapose that idea to all those numbers, seems kind of far-fetched. But the idea that counterinsurgency works is still alive. And it continues. And it continues because it's based on a story, or a narrative. And that narrative basically says that wars of counterinsurgency can be won as long as the hidebound, conventionally minded armies that are fighting these wars are transformed by savior generals who get these armies to refocus themselves to doing the proper methods of counterinsurgency. This narrative is the stock explanation for much of the writing that has been done on Iraq and Afghanistan. Here's just a few examples. Max Boot's new book, Invisible Armies, basically adheres to this narrative. Tom Ricks's two books, Fiasco and The Gamble. Linda Robinson's book, Tell Me How This Ends. Paula Broadwell's biography of David Petraeus, All In. Colonel Pete Mansour, who was General Petraeus' aide during the surge, has a book coming out in November, and the title of his book is Surge. Notice how we've lost the article. Used to be, usually most of us would refer to it as The Surge. Now in Pete's new book, he titles it Surge. Probably to put it in line with the great campaigns of military history, like you don't have the Agincourt, you just have Agincourt. You don't have the Austerlitz, you have Austerlitz. You don't have the D-Day, you don't have the Gettysburg. So now we have Surge. And then the subtitle of Pete's book really gives away how powerful this narrative of counterinsurgency is. The subtitle of it is this: My Journey with General David Petraeus and the Remaking of Iraq. And implicit in that subtitle is that something good was remade with General Petraeus and the surge in Iraq. And here's the basic points to the narrative, and it goes like this. And you've probably seen this before, and again, in writings about Iraq. From 2003 to 2007, the American Army fumbled. It didn't get counterinsurgency and fought the war wrongly. So that by 2006, or the end of the 2006, the war was lost. But then, as the narrative goes, an enlightened general, a savior general, to use popular historian Victor Davis Hanson's own words to describe this general, a savior general named David Petraeus, rode onto the scene, gave his army the classic ideas of counterinsurgency like protecting the people, turned his army around on a dime, got it doing something very, very different operationally, and because of this new and different transformative type of generalship and the fundamental change that he supposedly brought about with his army, Iraq was put on the path to success. Does this sound familiar? It should be. It's the standard stock narrative for most of the writings on Iraq. Unfortunately, however, it's mostly moonshine. And I say this as a historian because when I say it's moonshine, what the primary evidence suggests or shows is that there was no significant change between General Petraeus and the general that came before him, General George Casey. And in terms of operational method, there was much more continuity rather than discontinuity between the pre-surge and surge armies. The reason for the lowering of violence in Iraq that started in the summer of 2007 had much more to do with other conditions on the ground, like the spread of the Anbar Awakening that later became the Sons of Iraq, which was the Greater Sunni Awakening against al-Qaeda in Iraq. That combined with the Shia militia decision to stand down their attacks against Iraqi civilians, and that combined with the other critical condition, which was basically the sectarian civil war that occurred in Iraq from 2005 to 2006, had separated mixed areas in places like Baghdad. It was those three conditions that were the primary cause of the lowering of violence that occurred by the end of 2007. But many folks have come to believe that it was an enlightened general who transformed his army and got it doing counterinsurgency correctly, and this was the main cause for the lowering of violence. It actually, the idea that the surge, along with the transformative effects of Petraeus, brought these other conditions along. That's the basic story, or that's the basic narrative. And this myth of the savior general Petraeus in Iraq is premised on another myth from history, from the Vietnam War. And in that war, namely that General Creighton Abrams, when he took command from General Westmoreland in the summer of 1968, did basically the same thing that Petraeus did 40 years later. He turned the war around on a dime, got the American Army doing counterinsurgency correctly, and thus, of course, according to Abrams' hagiographer, Lewis Sorley, made it a better war. More moonshine. In fact, again, if one consults the primary evidence, and when I say primary evidence, I mean the documents, the stuff of history that historians use that are in the archives. And with regard to Vietnam, I'm talking about message traffic between Westmoreland and his higher headquarters in Washington, D.C., for example. The guidance that Westmoreland or Abrams gave to his subordinate commanders. Operational records, command post reports. This is the kind of primary evidence that I'm talking about. If one consults this primary evidence, one sees a striking level of continuity between Abrams and Westmoreland, and between the operational method of the Army under Westmoreland, and then again the Army under General Abrams. To be sure, such a story is a handsome one, since it offers up the idea that the Vietnam War was actually won in the South because of the changed ways of the American Army. But truth should never become the victim of a good story, even if that story is morally compelling. In the end, as far as military strategy for the U.S. in Vietnam, both Westmoreland and Abrams adhered to what back then was called a one-war concept, which had to balance the three pillars of the American war in Vietnam, which was the main force war against the North Vietnamese regulars, the Viet Cong regulars, pacification of the countryside, and building up the South Vietnamese military. In my view, the explanation for America's loss in Vietnam was not monster generals and stupid armies that didn't understand how to do counterinsurgency. Instead, the answer rests with a failure of grand strategy that should have realized early on that the war was unwinnable based on a moral and material price the American people were willing to pay. But this fundamental truth from the Vietnam War is obscured by this better war myth or narrative, that a failed grand strategy could have been rescued if there had only been better generals put in place early on who would have transformed their armies into counterinsurgency rock stars. And then Iraq came around. And the same narrative is applied and starts to unfold with Iraq in 2006. A war being lost by a failing army that didn't understand counterinsurgency, but was rescued by another savior general named David Petraeus, who turned the war around. And that explanation hardened into an accepted truth, almost really a fact, by the spring of 2009. And if you think about it, was applied almost directly as a template to Afghanistan. And the thinking went that since better generals and better tactics turned the war around in Iraq, according to the story or according to the narrative, just like it had happened in Vietnam, why not do it now in Afghanistan in the spring of 2009? And if you remember, there was the publicly humiliating relief of General David McKiernan, who was replaced by now the third savior general to ride onto the scene. I mean, in Vietnam, it's Abrams. In Iraq, it's Petraeus. And in Afghanistan in the spring of 2009, now it's Stanley McChrystal. The problem is with this whole narrative is that there was an opportunity, I think, in the spring of 2009, especially once you got into the summer and fall with a new American president, there was an opportunity to do a serious review of American strategy in Afghanistan. But the power of this counterinsurgency narrative, the idea that General Petraeus made counterinsurgency work in Iraq, therefore it could be made to work in Afghanistan, basically precluded any serious consideration of alternatives in Afghanistan in the summer of 2009 other than long-term counterinsurgency or armed nation building. And in my view, American strategy since 2002 has been in need of some serious review and criticism in Afghanistan. I think it's been broken. I think American strategy in Afghanistan has been broken from the start. And let me make an argument to try to tell you why that's so. But first, when I use the word strategy, let me define what I mean by strategy. And this is admittedly a simplified view of strategy. It's a simple explanation of it, but I think it gets at what strategy in war is really about. Think about it this way. In war, you have two things. Over on this side here is something called policy. And policy, just like Clausewitz says, puts war into place and gives it its objective, its political purpose. Like for the United States, the overall political objective in World War II was unconditional surrender. In the American Civil War, for Lincoln, it was to keep the Union together and then later to end slavery. That's policy that puts war into place. And then over here on this side, you have the resources of war. And oftentimes the resources of war are tactical military activity, where platoons, battalions, divisions fight. There are other resources of war too, right, including tactical military action. So you have policy over here, and you have the resources of war over here, like tactical military action. And then in the middle, kind of in like this conceptual place, is this thing called strategy. And if strategy is done right, what it should do is look to policy to see what the policy aim for the war is, and then look to the resources of war to apply those resources, like tactical military action, to achieve policy aims at the least amount of blood and treasure spent. If a state does strategy right in war, it should get an A, or at least a B+. I think American strategy in Afghanistan has failed. And here's why. The core policy objective for the United States in Afghanistan, from the beginning, from as early 2002, as has been stated, restated, affirmed, reaffirmed by both American presidents, every commanding general in Afghanistan, from General Franks to General Barno to General McNeil to General McKiernan to General McChrystal to Petraeus to Allen to Dunford, by secretaries of state, by secretaries of defense, by undersecretaries of state, when asked. And I say this because when I've given this talk before, sometimes people just say, no, it's not, that's not what it is. It's more than that. But when these individuals, right, when they have gone before Congress, like the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, when asked, say for example, General Franks, why are we in Afghanistan? Undersecretary of State Flournoy in 2008, why are we in Afghanistan? When asked that question by political leaders, the answer has been over and over and over again, and President Obama just restated this in his State of the Union address. When asked, why are we in Afghanistan? The answer is this: the destruction of Al-Qaeda. Period. Period. Which, if you think about it, is a very limited and actually quite appropriate policy objective for the United States. I'm saying American strategy has failed in Afghanistan because to get after and to achieve that core policy objective, the United States has applied a maximalist operational method of armed nation building or counterinsurgency to achieve that very, very limited core policy objective. It would be almost like, as a metaphor, if you had to pound a 6-inch nail through a piece of soft pine wood. And that's like the metaphor for your policy objective in war, right? And you want to do it with the least amount of blood and treasure spent, or the tools, right, to achieve that policy objective, right? What we have done in Afghanistan is you have used a jackhammer to pound that nail through that piece of soft pine wood, when a carpenter's hammer probably would have done the trick much better. Now, when I say American strategy has failed in Afghanistan, it's not that we in the American military haven't achieved tactical and operational successes. I mean, I can point to my own in West Baghdad in 2006 with Iraq, for example. But at some point in war, tactical and operational success are supposed to lead up to something greater. And I just don't see how that has happened in Afghanistan. And the reason why this narrative of counterinsurgency is important, I think, because the narrative says counterinsurgency worked in Iraq under Petraeus, but it's actually premised on a deeper idea. And the deeper idea is that it's not just that American counterinsurgency warfare works, it's that any kind of American war works. As, for example, calls for military intervention in Syria. 2 or 3 months ago, a historian at the University of Texas wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where he said, Jeremy Surrey said it was time to bomb North Korea. So premised in these calls for American military intervention in Syria, bombing North Korea, activities in Mali or Yemen or anywhere else, is the idea that American war works as long as we put the right generals in charge who tweak the tactics of their armies to get them doing the right kind of methods in these wars. So do you see why this myth is so appealing and dangerous at the same time? And do you also see why it's potentially a recipe for perpetual war? Now, I was at a debate 2 months ago at Grinnell College in Iowa with a man, John Noggle, who's a retired Army lieutenant colonel. Some of you might be familiar with him. He was one of the primary authors for Field Manual 3-24, the American Army and Marines Counterinsurgency Manual. He wrote a widely influential, and even though it was deeply wrong, still a very important book, titled Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, Counterinsurgency Lessons from Vietnam and Malaya. was the president of one of the leading think tanks in Washington, D.C., the Center for New American Security, and has been a big player in a lot of these debates and issues over the last 5 to 6 years. And John and I were in a debate at Grinnell College in Iowa 2 months ago, and the title of the debate was "Is Counterinsurgency Dead?" with a question mark. And John in the debate was clear that he accepted the basic framework for the counterinsurgency narrative, that it worked in Iraq under Petraeus, and that he turned the American army around and made it work in Iraq. And it became very clear that he was adhering to this counterinsurgency narrative in the debate. And it led him, I think, to a really foolish characterization of counterinsurgency warfare that John has also made in published pieces. He wrote a New York Times op-ed in March or April of last year, where he also used this characterization of counterinsurgency warfare. And this is the word that he used to describe counterinsurgency warfare. He calls them, quote, counterinsurgency wars, quote, unsatisfying wars, unquote. Because according to John, they are long, they are very cost intensive, they are oftentimes inconclusive, and they are hard for the American people to see their worth. And that's why he calls them unsatisfying wars. He also says that because we have fought these unsatisfying wars, like in Vietnam, like in Iraq, like in Afghanistan, in the past, therefore we will do so again in the future. But I got to thinking, and I asked myself, if Augustine was right, and then later B.H. Little Hart, who riffed on Augustine, when Augustine said that the object of war is to produce, quote, a glorious peace, unquote. And Little Hart in the 1930s said the object of war is to produce a better state of peace. And if we think in American history, examples of when a better state of peace was produced in American history, we can think of World War II, the American Civil War, maybe even part of the Korean War, when a glorious peace or a better state of peace was produced. And then I think we could call those wars satisfying wars. So if those are satisfying wars, like World War II, like the American Civil War, then why, I ask myself, would a state fight an unsatisfying war in the first place? Or continue one once it was started? Maybe what we should learn from Iraq and Afghanistan is that the only wars the United States should fight are satisfying wars. Even understanding satisfying wars like World War II, like the American Civil War, are full of death and destruction. That is the fundamental nature of war. So maybe, what we should learn from these wars is that we should only fight satisfying wars. And by definition, a satisfying war is one where strategy reigns supreme, it has choices, it considers alternatives, it is not overcome by operational and tactical frameworks, and a strategy that is premised on a firm grasp of the limits of American military power to transform the world.
Okay, thank you, Colonel Gentile. We got some really great questions, a lot of them, and I think they tie in a few themes. So I think the first one that came up, and there was a few questions around this, is what's the alternative to coin? Maybe I'll just stop there. What's the alternative to coin?
The alternative to coin is to well, first of all, I think in Afghanistan, the alternative to counterinsurgency would have been a much more reduced and limited American military presence that was focused on the core political goal of Al-Qaeda. And I think that could have been put into place much earlier than it seems to be. It seems to me that we're heading in that direction now. So in Afghanistan, I think that there were other options, but those options weren't considered. The other The other answer to that question is the alternative to counterinsurgency is really to step back from counterinsurgency and to put ourselves in this place of strategy, called strategy, and strategy should then ask itself, if this is what the core policy objective is, if this is what we're trying to achieve, is counterinsurgency the right operational framework or method to achieve it? I mean, I do think that American counterinsurgency could be made to work in Afghanistan, but it would take decades, because again, American counterinsurgency is the same thing as armed nation building. That's what it is. It's about building the institutions of a modern state. And if you're trying to do that in a place like Afghanistan, you're not going to be able to do it in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. It's going to take 30 or 40 or 50 years. And it's going to require a huge commitment. I mean, if we really, really do want to transform Afghanistan into a modern functioning state with these kinds of institutions, that's what it's going to take. But then again, if you're doing strategy right, you should be looking to what the core policy objective is, which again is quite limited, and then you would tell yourself that it's simply not worth doing that in Afghanistan in the first place.
Another key element of questions was around Syria specifically, and then some other potential for small wars. But there were some questions around how our situation in Iraq and Afghanistan might compare to Syria, and then also some questions about is the administration's reluctance to enter into Syria tying into either them kind of getting some messages that coin may not be the silver bullet that they'd need to be successful?
No, that certainly, it seems that President Obama, at least from what I've read, I mean, I'm not privy to any, like everybody else, I read the newspapers, I pay attention to things, and it certainly does seem like President Obama, thankfully, is taking a very, very cautionary approach to Syria, which I'm happy to say, as a serving Army colonel, I think my president is spot on correct with that cautionary approach to Syria. But there are plenty of voices out there, like Senator McCain, and a number of prominent intellectuals who are stridently advocating for the United States to become involved in some ways militarily in Syria. One of the recommendations is for the United States to put in a no-fly zone, right, where it uses its air power to keep the Syrian Air Force from flying. But part of the problem with this whole notion, based on the counterinsurgency narrative, that war works if you just get the right general in charge and tweak the tactics, is we've turned war into almost like a switch. Like you just turn it on, and then the light comes on, and things will be okay. I mean, that's almost, somehow it seems to me how people think about this. But let's say, for example, we did put into place a no-fly zone in Syria, which our Air Force and Navy could certainly do. What then is going to be, because we know that war is about action, reaction, counteraction, to the exponential effect, right? What is going to be, what will Russia do? What will Iran do? Who has, and those countries arguably have a much greater stake in what happens in Syria. And so I think that to sum up with that question, I think what we need to do is come off the idea that the answer to the problems in the world ultimately rest with the barrel of an American military gun solving those problems. And I just think that Syria is the idea that we can inject American military force into it, and that somehow that will produce the results that we're looking for. I just think it's like, so a good friend of mine at West Point, Colonel Pilar Ryan, just retired from the Army a couple of days ago. And she was telling me about how difficult it is to retire from the Army. It's just, you have to go through a lot of different things, medical, physical, all these, it takes months and months and months. And it occurred to me, it's a lot easier to get into the Army than it is to get out of the Army. Do you see where I'm going with this? It's really easy to get into a war or a conflict, But once you get into a war or a conflict, I mean, history shows this, it becomes very, very, very difficult to get out. And I fear that once we start to put our foot in the door militarily in Syria, it's going to be very difficult to get out. And I think ultimately it's not in our vital interest to do so.
Thank you, Ed. Another realm of, or another area of questions was specifically about counterinsurgency by defeating an enemy militarily. So maybe more of a scorched earth or direct enemy combating policy. And it seems one thesis talked about maybe the post-World War II Reconstruction being more successful because there was a complete victory, or also potentially COIN being kind of a soft-handed approach towards war that's maybe more palatable politically. And I wondered if you could talk about that.
No, I think those sets of questions draw on a really, it's an important point. That has been one, because often you wonder why is there so much power behind this counterinsurgency narrative, and not just the narrative, but Field Manual 3-24 when it first came out in 2007 with the surge. Why did it just? Because in the 1980s in the American Army we had this doctrine called air-land battle. And I mean, that was a really, really important doctrine for the American Army and for the American Air Force. But you didn't have policymakers speaking the language of the American Army's doctrine called air-land battle. But with counterinsurgency doctrine, by 2008 and 2009, you had policymakers speaking the language and the grammar of American counterinsurgency. Protect and serve the population. And so one of the reasons why it came in, and this argument that Fred Kaplan in his new book, The Insurgents, makes, that the American Army resisted counterinsurgency in 2007 and 2008 is just pure nonsense. As soon as it came in, the American Army immediately flipped and grabbed a hold of it, just like a whole number of policymakers did. And why? For the American Army, it was for a whole bunch of reasons. But for outside the American Army, I think it satisfied a number of different political contingencies. For the liberal internationalist left, it made it now seem like finally the American Army has figured out how to do war, but in a way that is moral, because they're using these words like serving and protecting the population, which is certainly the grammar of the doctrine. The problem, though, within that, and this is, I mean, just so you know, I mean, I came to these last 5 or 6 years working on strategy and counterinsurgency because I spent 2006 in West Baghdad as a cavalry squadron commander, and it was right in the middle of the Shia-Sunni civil war. And so when I came back in December of 2006, the new manual was out, and it took me about a month or two, but it was early 2007 when I finally sat down and I read the manual. And the two didn't, and so I read the manual, and I said, okay, this is the doctrine that my Army has given me. And it's supposed to be authoritative, it's supposed to be based on history, and it's supposed to make sense. And it's supposed to tell me as a professional soldier that if I apply this doctrine, then I have a reasonably good chance at success. But the doctrine that I was reading that was telling me about how to go about countering an insurgency didn't match up in any way with what I was seeing on the ground in Iraq. Because what I was seeing on the ground in Iraq was ultimately a violent civil war with my own unit and the rest of the American military caught in the middle of it. And it was a war that was fundamentally about death and destruction. But the counterinsurgency doctrine that was basically really co-opted by the policy world now made it seem, and then along with the whole surge narrative that started to develop, that it's made Iraq better because it helped to lower violence. Now all of it made sense, and it made it seem like finally we can make war work in the world because we've figured out the right method to do it. And so I think it had a strong sort of apparent moral component to it that really drew a lot of people to it.
Great. Quite a few questions around how the United States Army and maybe West Point has reacted to your interpretation of the counterinsurgency narrative. It was kind of interesting, the number of questions along that line. I'd be curious how that's being received.
Well, it hasn't helped us win at football, I'll tell you that much. It's fun. I often, this past year has been it's been a little dicey this past. When I first started writing in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, I was writing a lot. These are the basic themes that I laid out here tonight. I mean, questioning whether or not counterinsurgency worked, questioning the whole, elevation of rock star generals, whether or not they were as good as and effective as what was being said. But in those years, in 2008 and 2009, nobody really cared, I think, in the American Army. But this past year, it's gotten a little bit dicier because now I think, because when I was saying this in 2008 and 2009, Iraq seemed to be on the path to success. And things seem to be heading in the right direction in Afghanistan. And I think the last year or so has shown, Iraq, the civil war is already starting to bubble up again, partly because of what's happening in Syria, and also because of the reduction in the budgets and the fights between the Navy, Air Force, and the Army over the budget. Now I think that the Army is a little bit more sensitive to some of the things that I've been saying. But by and large, and I'm proud of this, even though I think there's plenty of folks in the Army who have disagreed with what I've said, and certainly at West Point, I think that my Army still embraces the idea of professional dissent, and that's why I've been allowed to say and to speak on the things that I have been.
Great, fantastic. One last question. Is it fair to characterize that we have a strong team, a strong set of tactics, but the operational goals or strategic goals are Herculean, and we just can't map up the actual folks we have on the ground and their tactics with the actual objectives?
Yeah, and let me just, I think I agree, Eaton, but let me shift it in a slightly different direction and say this, which certainly these wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, don't turn on the tactics. It's not that the tactics aren't important, they are, but they don't turn on tactical action of military force. These wars, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even in Vietnam, turned on much more important issues of strategy, of policy, of the conditions of the places where we fought, where we operated, like in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, the history, everything else, the amount of resources the United States was willing to commit. This is really the story of the British in the American Revolution. These wars turn not so much on the tactics involved, but on the strategies and policies that put them into place. The problem, again, and this is the point I've been trying to make, and the point I try to make in my book, the problem with the counterinsurgency narrative is that it's turned this, I think, this basic truth around. And now the answer to these wars is not by figuring out the right strategy and policy. And maybe in some of these places, the right strategy and policy is never to go in the first place. But what the counterinsurgency narrative has done is to put the focus of these wars on the tactics that were employed by these. This is what Andrew Kaprenovich argued in the 1980s with his book, The Army in Vietnam, where he said the Vietnam War could have been won if the American Army would have just figured out how to do the classic methods of counterinsurgency. But that's not why. The tactics, what the American Army did on the ground tactically, actually made perfect sense for the enemy that it was fighting. The problem with the Vietnam War, just like Iraq and just like Afghanistan, was the strategy and policy that put those wars into place at the start, and then carried those wars on. So the answer in these wars is not really about the tactics. It's about the strategy and policies that put them into place.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Colonel Gentile for